I didn't cross-stitch a Venmo QR code. I cross-stitched the QR code for our Wi-Fi. So you go into our house, there's this cross.
I stand corrected.
Yeah, just want to get that clear. Gant and I didn't coordinate our talks, but we might as well have. The consistency theme is going to continue, and so is the use of Zach Galifianakis thinking about math. I thought about changing it, but it's too good of a classic meme. Today I'm going to talk about the benefits of consistent code. I think most people would agree that code consistency is just a good thing without me spending a bunch of time talking about it. So I want to be specific about how I think we achieve consistent code and why it is so important. And React in particular lacks strong conventions. React is a library, as they say. But even the frameworks are agnostic when it comes to many of the decisions that you will need to make, like network and state libraries and separation of concerns. I'm Colin Gray, principal engineer at Shopify, and as of July, a resident of Stratford, Ontario. I actually got my permanent residency this year. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, to Canada. Like Ken said, I love to collect hobbies. He left some out, actually. So if you're into Arduino, mechanical keyboards, board games, rock climbing, tabletop role-playing games, and programming, of course, let's chat. But first, let's talk about design patterns. Programmers love a design pattern. And obviously, if you love a thing, you should have lots of those things. Like if you love mechanical keyboards, you own 12 of them for some reason. And if you love farming, even though your actual job is in tech, you own way too many tractors, Jamin. All right, someone has to say it. My original version of this joke was, Jamin has way too many children, which I still like for its kind of murdery vibe, but maybe too much for a general audience. Okay, but programmers, our drug of choice is design patterns. I am not innocent here. I presented my own terrible acronym in 2014. I love a good design pattern as much as anyone. The problem with all these design patterns, though, is, there it is, they're all very good, sometimes contradictory, and they all have nuance. We need to be clear about what we are trying to achieve by adopting these patterns. So here's what I propose you use as your North Star when applying your acronym of choice. Minimize decision fatigue. This goes to the heart of what I mean by default to consistent, but minimize decision fatigue was not a very snappy title. And my talk last year was default to performance, and that got me invited back. So don't fix what ain't broken. Except last year, my intro was way too long. And I went over by like 40 minutes or something. So to solve that problem, they're having me go first. Yeah, sorry about your dinner plans. It'll be fine. If you hear minimize decision fatigue and think, hey, that just sounds like convention over configuration, you're right. I'm not discovering the wheel here. But I do think that conventions must be in service of minimizing decision fatigue. Otherwise, you run the risk of being overly prescriptive. But I'm splitting hairs, and I definitely think Rails got it right in having lots of strong conventions. Okay, let's see if I can take some of our tried and true patterns and idioms and sharpen those by framing them in the context of decisions. Dry, don't repeat yourself, coined by Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas in The Pragmatic Programmer, stated as, every piece of knowledge must have a single, unambiguous, authoritative representation within a system. You may be thinking of database connection singletons, maybe schema or environment configuration files. And yeah, having a single source of truth is a big part of Dry. But zoom out a bit, and it's about the importance of single responsibility. So we might ask, how do we make a network request in this app? Who is responsible for this? And if the answer is YOLO, then you'll probably get this, a simple use query in a screen that needs data. Or this, they decided to wrap use query in a hook. That's great. Or this, because the developer is Leet, spelled with 3 threes, and you can't trust code you didn't write yourself, and how hard could it be to just send a request query anyway? Not to be outdone by formal Haskell guru turned web developer who sees great potential one day for a remix-style pattern, and I know I'm new here, but no, really, this works great in a to-do app I wrote this last weekend. This is fun, but the point I'd like to make is that before all this mess began, there should have been a moment when everyone agreed not to make the decision in ways. Don't repeat yourself is not just about avoiding copy pasta. It's often about not repeating decisions. So here we are. How to minimize decision fatigue, tip number 1. It's a meta tip, but honestly, this one will bite you the hardest. If you aren't in an organization or team that cares about this, it ain't gonna happen if you just start proposing new patterns out of nowhere. You need to first have the buy-in that consistent code is worth doing really well. Pro tip, just show them this video, this presentation, drop the mic, walk away. You're welcome. Next up, I actually prefer the Sandi Metz follow-up to dry, sometimes called AHA, or avoid hasty abstractions. Prefer duplication over the wrong abstraction. If you don't know Sandi Metz, pull up her blog, watch her talks. I think she nails this stuff. Notice, please, that she says duplication here. Don't gloss over that choice of word. Two pieces of code that do similar work should look almost identical, dare I say consistent. I'll try to give an example of this. We use a wrapper component called screen in the Shopify app that has some sensible default handling of error messages and loading state, and so we end up with this boilerplate on every screen. So loading status, that can show the spinner, whether it's refreshing or not, like a pull to refresh, what to do when they pull to refresh, et cetera, et cetera. We could introduce this new status object, right? Remove that repetition. But have we reduced decision fatigue? Yeah, this decreases the lines of code, but that previous version was aligned with the return value from useQuery. And we don't already have this status object. So we have to add that everywhere that uses this new pattern. What's actually wrong with this code? It's actually here. The developer has to decide how to render content when we don't have data, or we do have data, or we don't have error, but do have data. This is really what we want. With this abstraction, the network screen can decide how to show the spinner UI based on the loading state. And only then does the presence of data determine whether to show a no results screen. If the data is present, we call the function, removing undefined and null from that TypeScript type. And we removed toil. We removed a decision that developers had to make, and the UX was improved with this new no results screen. So, tip number 2, start with duplicate code. Look at the other features and follow their lead. If you think you found a better pattern, bring it up, discuss it, and update it everywhere, not just your own pet feature. This is minding the commons. And it doesn't happen when you YOLO some goofball, homebrewed, half-baked visitor pattern that you hid deep in your features component folder, and yes, sorry, this is a real chip on my shoulder. This tip is carrying a lot of weight. I'm going to break it down into more actionable tips. So tip 2A, document canonical code. Recommending write more documentation always leaves much to be desired. You have to be diligent about maintaining the docs and pointing people to them, but this is probably a culture you should be optimizing anyway. But hand in hand with documenting standards, and arguably even better, get comfortable writing ESLint rules that enforce your code styles. Programmers are going to be lazy, but if you stop them the moment they are writing that incorrect code, they will try to do the right thing. Another trick you should consider, what are you going to do? Stack Overflow has a custom keyboard based on the fact that we just are going to copy-paste. Leverage this fact. Programmers are going to look in the nearest place to copy code that gets them started, so stick an examples folder at the root of your project and put a bunch of boilerplate in there. It's easier to update than docs because you don't have to words. And you can optimize it for easy search replace, which means lazy programmers will choose it first. It seems to me, though, if you're going to go to the trouble of having this reference implementation, you might as well use code generators. Save the best for last, right? Shout out to our gracious hosts. They call this feature of Ignite the true gem. Well done. If you're not using Ignite, I may have another option for you. Ignite uses EJS templates, and I think they're great. You can easily see what's going on here, right? Another option, though, tsmorph can generate code. It's kind of obtuse, yeah? You maybe can't tell at a glance what this is going to generate. It's actually the same as the previous slide. The big advantage here, though, is once you know tsmorph, you can also do code mods, which, by the way, are made much easier by a large amount of highly consistent code. And yes, this code is more obtuse. Oh, yes, this code is more obtuse than EJS, but what is an excellent source of documentation? Tests. So throw a couple tests in here and that'll clear things right up. Next up, fundamental theorem of software engineering. That's right, I brought out the big guns. This was the name given to an idea that Andrew Koenig heard from Butler Lamson, who at his award ceremony for the Turing Award shared a quote from David Wheeler, who said, "We can solve any problem by introducing an extra level of indirection." Butler Lamson told Andrew Koenig, a quote from David Wheeler. All right, how does this apply to minimizing decision fatigue? What is an extra level of indirection? So back to some Shopify code. We have a lot of screens that have some version of this use layout effect. This sets the navigation options. And they often need to get values out of state. We use selectors for this, all right? When those values change, the options are updated. Seems fine. But using a selector here means that the screen is also re-rendering, which breaks one of our rules. Avoid unnecessary screen re-renders. It's a high-level component, and that's going to cascade down. We want to prevent that. The problem with finding an appropriate abstraction is that all these set option calls were different. Like the API was already a good abstraction. So how do we refactor this to avoid re-renders and all these different screens with wildly different use cases? And if you said migrate to signals, you're actually correct. And that is a very good way to solve this, but we didn't do that in this case. Our solution was to introduce a new component convention. As a leaf node, the navbar component can now re-render without triggering renders on the entire screen component. And all the navbar related code is now co-located. What I mean is every screen has a navbar component, which means if you are building a new navbar component, you have all these reference implementations to go to see how you would do that. The reason we could identify this refactor and update it quickly and universally was because all of our screens had this snippet of code that was all but identical. Even though the status quo wasn't ideal, and we knew it, we waited until we had a better solution and we required people to use the existing pattern so that we could change it all at once. Another way to think of the fundamental theorem of software engineering is code organization and conventions. Wow, it's like every single one of these topics comes back around to consistency. Weird, right? All right, so now I thought I would share a few of the conventions that we use in the Shopify app. I don't think these are mind-blowing, but honestly, you'd be surprised how many people are writing 4,000 line screen files that could be refactored into highly testable, isolated hooks and components. You'll still have 4,000 lines of code. We're just shuffling the vegetables around on the plate. But testability and the ability to focus on specific problems matters. We learned this in the massive view controller days. So this is some real code from the Shopify app with very minor edits. This is actually not using our latest network state pattern, which consolidates UI and network queries into one store, but this will do. All right, everywhere you see customer's overview is both a convention and an additional level of abstraction. So we have internationalization hooks. These are created for every screen. We have query view model creators. We call them builders. I mean, they are builders. And then we have these actions hooks. These return all the callbacks grouped into one object for that screen. And then we have the navbar, like we talked about before, and we have our screen component. I might come back to this if I have time at the end. So tip number 3, have strong opinions about where almost every bit of code goes. I might be repeating myself here because we touched on this in the dry slide. See, the problem with all these design patterns boiling down to be consistent and avoid decision fatigue, it's hard to avoid repeating myself. You've got to be ruthless about this one because React lets you be lazy about where you put things and how you implement things. Fundamental theorem is your friend here. It says that a simple wrapper is a code organization lever that will help you keep your higher level component lean. It's not zero cost though. You'll have a little more follow the bouncing ball, the more, I don't have this note, and I'm like missing my word. The more abstractions that you introduce, the more you have to kind of follow the train of thought. These are some of the places that we have abstractions in the Shopify app. Flash list composers is maybe an interesting one. This is something we've introduced internally. We haven't blogged about it a lot, but basically we have a outside of React declarative way to define screens that are leveraging flash list. Flash list does really well with just like rendering all the time and giving it all your components. So if you're using flash list, hopefully we'll have a blog post out soon about how these composers work. So there we have it. Keep decision fatigue in mind, and consistent code will just fall out of the woodwork. I've butchered a lot of famous people's words today, so let me recap using some of my own. We saw some of the layers that we use in the Shopify app. I would posit that React makes it very, very easy to avoid abstraction layers. So lint rules, generators, documentation, example implementations, whatever you can do to make it easier to do the right thing. Because when you have a lot of abstraction layers, that necessarily also means that you have a little more boilerplate. Remember dry. Boilerplate is often, but not always, an opportunity to refactor. And remember aha, not all repetition is bad. Consistent code not only provides high signal-to-noise ratio when it comes to identifying opportunities to remove repetitive code, it also makes it much easier to remove that repetitive code later. regex will only get you so far. Check out tsmorph, or for a real Maxell cassette experience, try AST-grep. Take your time choosing your tools. You should do everything you can to keep using those tools in every project. A quick aside, actually, Ignite does a great job of this as well. It's strongly opinionated, and I think that's great. I really love that. When everyone is using the same tools, you can write abstractions or plugins that improve the developer experience for your entire team. Try to use the same conventions, and try to use the same libraries in every app you build. At Shopify, we have a shared command line tool that we use to stand up developer environments. Every improvement we make to that tool impacts thousands of developers. It is tempting, especially during, God forbid, large rewrites or large-scale refactors, to optimize for short-term velocity. Every bone of our body should be screaming out against the tech debt these projects incur. But there is a way out, and that's by enforcing consistency early on. Better to have arbitrary but strongly enforced separation of concerns, because later you'll have a much easier time refactoring those into latest and greatest patterns than if you have many dissimilar spaghetti monsters. Strongly opinionated conventions can feel like they take away autonomy. They shouldn't. If they do, you've probably gone too far. Remember, minimize decision fatigue is the goal here. When you've done it right, your developers should feel like they are free to focus on their problem. The libraries and tools are so familiar, they just fade into the background. Plus, every person in the organization can lend a hand because all the patterns are familiar, right? Oh, that's a nice troll. Is that like Ken or Gant? It's worth saying one last time. Reducing decision fatigue means that you don't have every one of your developers making lots of different micro decisions on every feature and app. They know how the code is organized. They know which tool to use and why. Lastly, establishing one right way to organize code or choosing one correct library requires collaboration, humility, and buy-in. Your most senior devs should be the most humble. They should be pulling ideas out from everyone, but they are also the ones who are on the hook for these decisions. Design by committee is an easy way to fall into the trap of bike shedding. So, have a brainstorming session led by someone who has the autonomy to make the final call, and hire senior people who can listen honestly. Surprisingly, when I practiced this demonstration, I had like 10 minutes left over. So I'm going to go back to the customer's overview screen and dive into a few details. I hope that concrete examples are helpful here. And I'm not close, yeah, I have 6 minutes left according to this. Okay, so here we are. I updated this to use local store. This is the current Shopify state management, and it combines UI and network requests. And that's an odd little snippet of code, I think. It's not typically how you would say, on-screen mount, do this query. It's like a a terrible combination of hooks and imperative code. Oh, this is just that one again. But I think, oh, I put these out of order. All right, hold that thought. The use I18N, the reason that we consolidate these into a hook, or why we wrap them in a hook, is because wherever the location of that file is determines where the translations have to be. So this was just an easy way to make sure that every component in this folder, all the customers overview components, have the same translations file. So that's all we did there. Surprisingly though, that was a huge quality of life improvement. Okay, back to the that local store. I have a chip on my shoulder. I have a lot of chips on me. If you've talked to me, you've heard me rant. So I would like you to look at this, and when does this send the query? How does this hook work? You have no idea, right? You've never seen it before. Use fetch is a new thing. I just made it up. But if I say use query, then you say, oh, on mount. I know when that fires. Congrats, you know an API that everyone knows, right? It's a very common API. It's a bit of a straw man. It bugs me. I don't like that this has behavior that I can't see here. I like explicit. It also bugs me that refetch is not based on when the component is mounted, right? And if you use lazyQuery, you have a fetch function. That's also different. Those differences, it's like going back to dry and aha, like, oh, our abstraction is wrong because we have these inconsistencies between them. So we don't do that. We have an imperative API, and we have an easy place to call that. And you know, you've never seen this before, right? You never saw use fetch and you couldn't answer, but here you're like, I know exactly when this works. Although on start, that is a little bit of implementation detail. That's when the store is created. We also have on mount, so you have to know that. But I think hopefully you knew, like, yeah, components thing, yeah. All right. Like I say, straw man arguments, they're easy to tear down. Next up, oh, I copied that every time. The callbacks function here, this is a fun one. I think I talked about this last year. I keep trying to open source this 30-line file, and it hasn't happened yet. Organizations. What this is it's a collection of all the callbacks in this screen, and they look something like this. So there's these files where all of the button events and all that stuff, they're all co-located. Kind of like a reducer, except reducers are only for state changes because state changes are a special kind of side effect and all other side effects don't belong in the reducer. That doesn't make any sense to me. Like, it's the place where side effects go. Again, if you're having some side effects outside and some side effects in, maybe your abstraction is wrong. I'm not picking on Redux. Yes, I am. So we use this use actions to group things together. Our state management that you saw before is, like I said, selector-based. And this is where some of the network state gets really cool. So in this case, I'm getting the status of just one query. But we also have a function that says combine the statuses of these 3 queries. Or if it's paginated, then the status will be based on pagination. It'll have like the can load more and all that. This allowed us to do the exact refactor that I said would be difficult before. In the network screen at the bottom, we now have that status object. So we were able to actually refactor that. But we waited. Again, like, you have to wait to do these the right way. The last thing I'll point out here, and oh man, it's at 9:29 right now. Oh, that's so satisfying. I really went so far over last year. I was very concerned about it. Okay, so we have this send and store. And that is our greatest tool. These are passed directly. They're dependency injected. They're always a pair. Everyone knows them. They know what goes in each one. And we just kind of send them down the tree. When you go to mock a component, so like if you imagine testing this component, all of the callbacks are in send. All of the state is in store. Setting up mocking, it's like you don't have to use jest.mock anymore. You just pass it mocks directly. It's awesome. Okay, so thank you. And somehow yeah.